Amnesty International alleges Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza constitutes genocide.
Amid the Israel-Hamas war, there's a genocide in Gaza.
Israel is committing genocide.
Committing genocide.
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 More than 108 groups are warning about a mass starvation in the region.
Gaza's humanitarian disaster where children are starving to death.
Gaza is being strangled. There's hardly any food, water, or shelter.
Israeli strikes, Adrian, are probably the biggest test yet for this ceasefire.
The Hamas-led health ministry is reporting that more than 70,000 people have been killed in the enclave.
The U.S.-backed ceasefire in Gaza took another hit today as Israeli strikes pounded the Palestinian territory.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda Ashkenazi, the Director of Education at HR Canada Charitable Organization. The topic of tonight's conversation, the idea of the newsroom activist, was not arrived at in the abstract. Over the past year, HR Canada Charitable Organization undertook a large-scale, data-driven study of the CBC coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. Using artificial intelligence to analyze thousands of articles over a 20-month period, the research examined long-term patterns in the outlet's coverage. What the study raised, and what we've heard echoed by journalists, policymakers, and members of the public since its release, is a deeper concern. When coverage consistently pulls audiences towards moral conclusions, at what point does journalism stop observing conflict and begin participating in it? That is why we are hosting tonight's discussion, not to debate headlines, but to step back and examine the cultural and institutional shifts shaping conflict reporting today, but especially as it relates to the Israel-Hamas war. To help us do that, we are joined by two people whose experiences span decades and speaks directly to these questions. Our moderator and host for this evening is Peter Kent. Peter spent 4 decades as a journalist, working as a reporter, producer, and anchor for CBC, CTV, Global, and NBC News, covering conflicts around the globe. He reported from the front during the Yom Kippur War, worked extensively out of NBC's Tel Aviv bureau, and witnessed firsthand many of the defining geopolitical moments of the late 20th century. Following his journalism career, Peter served 13 years in federal politics, including as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and Minister of the Environment. Peter brings a rare combination of newsroom experience and institutional and policy perspective, exactly what this conversation requires. Sitting down with Peter this evening is our guest, Yaakov Katz. Yaakov is an author, journalist, and senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, as well as the co-founder of MEAD, the premier Middle Eastern Policy Forum. From 2016 to 2023, he served as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, where he continues to write as a columnist. He also writes for the Jewish Chronicle, hosts the JPPI podcast, and appears regularly on CNN and the BBC as an Israel analyst. Prior to his role at the Jerusalem Post, he served as a senior policy advisor to Naftali Bennett during his tenure as Israel's Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. With that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Peter, who will begin tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. And Yaakov, I think we probably agree that mainstream media is facing a lamentable moment of truth, at least for the Western legacy media, since October 7th in terms of coverage of the Gaza war. When I was a young reporter in the 1960s, the holy grail of journalism was objectivity, focusing on verifiable facts rather than personal, political, or emotional biases. It was an imperfect ideal, of course, for any number of reasons, but major newsrooms had layers of editorial management. There were fact checkers, and opinion was largely kept to editorial pages and columnists. As we know all too well, legacy media has declined spectacularly in this century. Yaakov, you've spent your career reporting from Israel and have seen increasing imperfect, inaccurate, and unbalanced reporting on Arab-Israel conflict in the Levant. Did you ever imagine how much more flawed coverage would be after October 7th?
Well, first of all, excuse me, Peter, let me just say it's great to be with you and to thank again Honest Reporting. And it's humbling to share the stage with you. Let me just say that as well. You know, someone who spent so many years in journalism and then transitioned to politics and really served in both hats and very prominent positions. Really a pleasure and an honor. I think that, and I'll just add to what you said about objectivity, and you know, I think you probably agree with me, is that one of the other big problems that we have today, it's not just the objectivity that's missing. It's not just that people are inserting their opinion and there's no longer just telling a story and giving over facts for what they're worth, but truth is an elusive term in today's world as well. We don't know what's true. And I could tell you, and I'm sitting in Jerusalem, and I could tell you it's dark outside, which means it's nighttime, and I could have somebody next to me who says, no, it's day, it's light, and go try to explain that that's not real. And that kind of connects to your question, I think, which is that when we look at the aftermath of October 7th and the way that this story has been reported and told by the world, and mainstream legacy media in particular, you look at the story sometimes and you say to yourself, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing? What story are they telling? Because that's not the story of what's really happening. And how does something like this actually occur? You know, a great example of this was just about 2 weeks into the war after October 7th, right? The most horrific massacre against Jews since the Holocaust, the most Jews murdered on a single day since the Holocaust. Yes. And 1,200 people killed in the worst ways imaginable, 251 held in Gaza still. And there was that story that night of reports came out that Israel had bombed a hospital in Gaza. The whole world, literally the entire world, from the New York Times to CBC, to the National Post, to just everyone, right, to the Wall Street Journal and beyond, reported how 500 people had been killed. It wasn't, none of it was true. It was totally disconnected. A, Israel didn't bomb a hospital. B, no missile or bomb hit the hospital. A misfired Palestinian rocket landed in the parking lot. There was nowhere near 500 people killed. It was more like 12 people killed, but not at all connected to Israel. But that didn't stop all of the media from reporting this. Now, you would have thought, Peter, that in the aftermath of something like October 7th, and by the way, we're talking less than 2 weeks since after this had happened, that there would be some, you know, just sympathy by patients. I don't know, but something. I mean, people would, you know, just be a little extra careful. No, nothing. It does nothing. And then, you know, I just think of that moment always, because that happened. It was still so raw, and people and the media was so quick to buy the lie that where we are now is no surprise at all, right?
Now, the last couple of decades, digital technology, social media, smartphones have made literally anybody a potential publisher of disinformation, misinformation, truth, falsehood, incitement, or hate. Do you believe that inflammatory social media have influenced mainstream newsrooms and editorial decision-making?
No, I mean, 1,000,000%, for the very simple reason, you know, I always viewed myself as a traditionalist journalist, right? In the old school way of doing things, which I think you'll probably appreciate, the news pages are news pages. The opinion pages are the opinion pages. Now, of course, as an editor, you get to make decisions of what stories are going on page one and what's above the fold, what's below the fold, what's the headline, what's the picture. All of those decisions are meant to influence the hearts and minds of your readers, right? If you put a inflammatory headline, if you put something of controversial picture, the stories that you put above the fold are the stories that you're basically telling to your readers. These are the stories I think are important, right? So these decisions are always being made. And that's why objectivity, it was never a question. It's never been a zero-sum game, as some people like to look at it. It's a question of who's more objective and who's less objective, right? Who's more of a militant, who's less, who's pushing an agenda more and who's pushing an agenda less. So these were always kind of, but I always tried to be the old school. I look at the way social media has impacted the situation today. There aren't many journalists like that around today, right? Because what social media has done by dragging us all into the gutter to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. To stand out, you have to be inflammatory. To stand out, you have to be controversial. Otherwise, it's as if you don't exist. So that idea or that ideal of just being, the reporter's reporter and just telling the story for what it is and giving it to your readers to make their decisions. I stand by that value. I'm sure you do as well, Peter. But in today's reality, it's very difficult to find journalists like that anymore. They're immediately looking for, how can I stand out? How can I build my name? How can I build my followers? How can I create traction? How can I make noise? How can I make the story about me? Now, back when you were a journalist and back when I was, doing this full time, it was not about us. It was about the story, right? It was about the publication. It's not like that anymore. And I think that has been very detrimental because not only does it change the focus, but then it does another thing. And this is probably even worse. It's no longer about accuracy, it's about speed. And when it's about speed, what ends up happening is you throw the fact checkers, right? That you spoke about, the layers of editorial staff and editors and reviewers, it all goes to the side because what's more important now is how fast can I get this out and can I be the first? And if it's wrong, who cares, right? The damage is done. It doesn't make a difference. No one's going to apologize, right? We'll just move on. We'll keep scrolling through the feed, and that causes real damage.
Now, aside from absolute misinformation, disinformation, and lies, we've also seen the old moral equivalence. We've seen the proportionality argument of Israel's response to Hamas terrorism. We've seen gullible, history-deficient commentators on 24-hour news services, and we've seen unquestioned challenge to Hamas propaganda. Are these case studies for journalism schools, or are they studies that will never be held?
Look, I hope they will be held. I fear that they will not, right? One thing that I've rallied against all throughout this war has been the issue of the death toll that has been reported from Gaza. Yeah. Now, I don't know how many people have been killed in Gaza, right? I know it's a lot of people. I know it's in the tens of thousands. I mean, there's no denying the tragedy that has befallen the Gaza Strip, and I have no problem admitting or confirming and announcing, yes, there is a tragedy. I look at whose fault is for that tragedy, and I would point the finger at Hamas because of igniting this war, launching their attack against Israel, and the way that they fight by embedding themselves in civilian infrastructure. But here's the very simple question that I've asked from the beginning, which I can't get an answer to, Peter. Why did the media from day one just eat up and repeat the Gaza Health Ministry death toll as if it's some objective Red Cross, United Nations entity? This is Hamas. Like, no one in the right mind would have ever reported, when the military was fighting in Afghanistan, right? No one would have said in the Canadian media, the Al-Qaeda Health Ministry has reported this, that, and the other, and just reported it as is from Al-Qaeda. No one would have done this during the anti-ISIS campaign back in 2017, 2018. It's unheard of to quote ISIS Health Ministry, Al-Qaeda Health Ministry. But for some reason, when it comes to Hamas, it's okay. Now, again, yes, lots of people have been killed, and it is a real tragedy. But why is there such an imbalance here? And I feel that this is something that people really need to answer for how this came to be. By the way, Israel also has responsibility. We can't ignore that as well. I mean, Israel, in my opinion, I just wrote a piece about this the other day, should have been quicker to do its own analysis, should have put out a counter narrative. That's a whole separate question, and we should take responsibility for that as well. But again, when I look at the media, it's something that I can't still understand how that's allowed and how that's tolerated. So I hope that people will learn lessons. I hope that they'll look at that. I hope that we will ask ourselves genuinely, did the media tell the story of what Hamas really did in the right way? Is numbers the full story, or is there another story to be told here? And I hope that people will learn their lessons. Tragically, though, I don't count too much on it happening.
Well, it's pretty clear that some journalists, some news organizations, as some governments, view the war that Hamas has started through a moral lens, as colonizer versus victim, oppressor versus oppressed, and that Israel has no right to pursue absolute victory over Hamas.
Which is 100% true. And that narrative has been pushed from day one of this war, right? The idea that these were people who were held in a prison, and as if Gaza was this prison, and they were fighting for freedom, right? I mean, look at the issue that still comes up. It pops up every once in a while still. Women's groups and their complete silence when it came to the sexual abuse of women at the Nova Festival or in the kibbutzim during the Hamas attack, as if it didn't happen, as if suddenly, if you're an Israeli or you're a Jew and it's sexual abuse against you, then we, the women, don't stand up, right? Whatever happened to the Me Too campaign, all of that silence, it's deafening. And it says something about the complete immoral balance that exists today in the world, and how this really is a advocacy through journalism, unfortunately. I would hope, but I'm also not naive, and I don't think you are either, Peter, that this can change, and that people want to change. People don't want to change. I think what we can all do in a much better way is we can help shine a light on that, on those failures, and put a spotlight and say, okay, this is something that is not acceptable, right? This type of storytelling is not the storytelling that we want, that we're willing to tolerate, and call them out for it, right? And that's an important tool to be able to at least show where that imbalance is taking place.
Now, as Amanda mentioned, the HR Canada Charitable Study on Canada's national public broadcaster, the CBC, suggests that certain narratives recur so consistently on the CBC that they appear to be institutional rather than incidental. When does the pattern consistency signal editorial direction or activist orientation rather than independent, fair, and balanced journalism? And how does the public see it, or does the public at times not want to see it because of the opinions that have been influenced by social media and hate?
Well, I think that the public, if they're given the opportunity, right, people want, people pursue, I think, by instinct. They do want the truth. They do want, I think people, I want to believe at least, that they're inherently good, and that they seek, and they have that same curiosity that led you to go through and travel around the world in pursuit of a story, as it did for me. So I think that's what people want. I think that what ends up happening is when they're watching channels like CBC, which I've interviewed a number of times during this war, or BBC, or any of these other news stations around the world, what they are getting is an engineered, manipulated view of reality, right? And sometimes it's as simple as the language that is used, right? It's as simple as a question, but phrased in a specific way to make it seem that Israel is the aggressor as opposed to, let's say, being the victim. I remember one interview I did, it was on BBC, where I was floored by the question itself. It was the day after an Israeli couple, which had just been driving up north in northern Israel, and in the worst luck known to mankind, a Hezbollah rocket was fired and landed and hit their car as it was driving on a highway, and they were both killed, leaving 3 or 4 orphans, right? I mean, just terrible tragedy. And things were escalating in the north, and I go on the BBC for an interview, and the woman, the anchor, says to me at some point, you know, Hezbollah, and I'm talking about how we got to defend ourselves, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And she says, no, but Hezbollah is only attacking Israel out of solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. And I was just floored. Like that solidarity for the people of Gaza is to kill a couple driving in a car and now leave 3, 4 orphans? How does, like, what world do we live in? That is a legitimate perspective and a question that can be asked on such a channel. And I was just, I usually keep my composure, but there I was just blown away because it was just so raw still. So, I mean, you know, is that anchor an anti-Semite? I don't think so, right? But is the worldview warped because there is a cultural bias that is so institutionalized in these media organizations? 100%, right? That has to be known. I mean, you know, the study of that HR did in Canada of the CBC just underscores that reality of how this exists, this sentiment, this bias is just there. It's always there. Now, it doesn't mean, and this is something that's important to say, Peter, because, I mean, you know this just as well as I do. It doesn't mean the journalists are evil or they're anti-Semites, right? Some of them are Jews. Some of them are married to Jews. Some of them will tell you our best friends are Jews, right? And they don't hate Israel. I've been to Israel. I have family in Israel. All true. But there is a culture, a foundation that exists there that leads this to happen, that leads the framing of the questions and the conversation to be seen and to be spoken about in a certain way.
But there have also been complaints as well about the narrow range of Jewish opinion that has been represented on Canada's national public broadcaster. What responsibility do institutions have? I don't know the answer to this, but I want to hear it again from you. What responsibility do they have to listen when minority communities say they're being misrepresented on their national public broadcaster?
Well, I mean, look, diversity of opinion is probably one of the utmost important values of any news organization. Because again, in a real world, we as the media are not supposed to tell you what to think. No. We're supposed to give you the information for you to make the educated decisions. That's how I view it. I'm sure that's how you viewed it, right? And it's about giving people tools and knowledge that they can make informed decisions. Now, they could go right, they could go left, they could go center, they could stay on the fence, but that's up to them. The same should be reflected in our opinion pages. Give people right-wing opinions, give people left-wing opinions. When I think about it from the Israeli perspective, share both ideas, get upset. But if I just feed you what you already believe, what am I doing, right? I mean, this journalism is meant to be, it's not just another job. You're not just a plumber or a lawyer or a tech worker. You have a civic duty, right? And that civic duty ties into a responsibility to provide people the tools and the information and knowledge. When you are running a TV station and you're only bringing a certain type of speaker to be your analyst, right? Or to be your commentator, you are being negligent with that role that you have in society, right? Not to mention the fact that you're maligning a segment of your society and of your population that wants to hear a different opinion, that is a tax-paying demographic, just like anyone else, is helping to fund a channel like CBC, BBC, or others, public broadcasters, and you are mistreating and misrepresenting them, and they have those rights just as well, especially in the event of a public broadcaster, which is a whole other layer of that conversation. So, I mean, this is just a total mismanagement and a negligent mistake to when not giving that proper balanced representation.
Well, and you speak to editorial mismanagement. The HR Charitable study also found that moral narratives are treated as given by the CBC rather than hypotheses that should be tested or challenged or questioned. Are we talking about newsroom groupthink, sort of from editorial mismanagement down through the various layers to the actual delivery on air?
Well, I think it's definitely, it's coming from somewhere, right? It's not just out of nowhere, and there's groupthink. It part of it is connected also to lack of diversity in the newsroom. If we apply it for a second, let's say to issues that they deal with, let's say in the United States, so not enough sometimes coverage of immigrant communities, of the African American community, of the welfare, poverty issues. And some of that you could trace back to the fact that you just don't have enough African American writers or reporters or Latino immigrants on staff, right? I think in Israel, for example, we have issues in the large news organizations here as well. We don't have enough of the Arab voices in media, which speaks to sometimes, when there's crime that is terrible for Israeli Arab communities. I'm not even talking about Palestinians, Israeli citizens. It's something that we don't always get enough coverage of because of the fact that we just don't have enough of that representation in the newsroom. So one is connected to the other, but I think there's also something else here, Peter. We're talking around the time of just great tension, of course, with Iran, right? And one of the things that jumps out to all of us, and you don't have to have any special information to see this. Everybody knows about the protests and the demonstrations against Israel that took place, of course, at Columbia University and Concordia and all over North America and Europe, right? I mean, there's no protest about Iran on any college campus anywhere. Okay, so you can say, you know what? It's different. It's not the same. Okay, fine. College campus is fine. Maybe I'll be willing to put that aside. What about media coverage? So I just oversaw a study that was done, that we took some of the major news outlets in English speaking, so from the UK, Canada, and the United States, and looked at 2 periods of time. We looked at, let's say, the last 5-6 weeks when Iran has really been at its height, and using AI similar to the HR Canada study of CBC to try to not necessarily looking at sentiment, but looking at mentions, just scope, coverage of Iran. And then we also looked at the same period of time coverage of Israel. Now, Israel's much less on the front burner right now, right? There's still what's to report about and going on, but much less. The second period of time we looked at was when Israel was really at the height, which was back about a year and a bit ago, when Israel was just going into the southern city of Gaza called Rafah, right? And that was like a big moment. The numbers are crazy. I mean, forget about the fact that when Israel was going into Rafah, the mentions were just in the thousands, right? And with Iran, it's just in the hundreds. But when you look at this period of time when Iran is so dominant, Israel reporting and Iranian reporting is pretty much 1-to-1. And you say to yourself, how does that make sense, right? Why are they so obsessed at a time that there are people, tens of thousands of people reported to be slaughtered on the streets of Iran, and they're still writing about Israel? Like, that tells you something. There's something deeper here, Peter. This isn't just about diversity of voices or reporters or, representation in the newsroom of minorities. There is an agenda here that is being pushed, and sometimes they don't even know they're pushing it, but they are pushing it.
Now, the HR charitable study follows a very similar study with very similar results on the UK's national public broadcaster, the BBC. You mentioned it. Now, both of these national public broadcasters have parliamentary mandates to inform, not to advocate. How do information consumers in Canada, in Great Britain, demand that the national public broadcaster return to informing and reporting factually rather than advocating?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. It's a big one, and it's tough to make that to impose that change, right? I think it requires lobby and it requires political power. But one thing that thankfully both those countries do have, as very vibrant and strong democracies, is you can vote, right? And you can make this an issue, and you can demand. And Peter, you're a reporter turned into a politician. Now you're a recovering politician and a recovering reporter. But you probably more than a lot of people know that kind of that relationship between both worlds of journalism and the accountability that is demanded in politics and in government. So I think that they can definitely use that political power, use that lobby, demand more accountability, demand more change, launch a protest, stop to pay the tax. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done, but I think that the most important thing that can be done by people is you can vote with your with your remote control, essentially. Stop watching, right? And consume other media. Do yourself a favor and don't just digest one news organization anymore. And by the way, that's the sad reality that we live in. I mean, Peter, back I think in when you was the NBC, right, for a period of time. I mean, yes. these were news channels that they were anchors of truth to some extent. Like when you watched them, you felt that you were getting the story, and you didn't have to go somewhere else. I think today we're all mature enough and knowledgeable enough to know that you can't count on one media organization anymore. Those days are over. And there's some sad to that, but there's also a strength in that, because competition breeds a wider menu and variety of different opinions and stories and approaches and attitudes that you can consume and get access to, which is, I think, makes for a healthier democracy and a greater opportunity for people to get the better more accurate information.
Well, unfortunately, Canadians have been voting with their eyeballs, and CBC ratings have been spectacularly low compared to the last century, for example. But Canadians invest a great deal of money into the BBC, and one would hope that in the interests of that parliamentary mandate and basic democratic truths, that the CBC management would find the path to balance again. Now, everything that we've discussed so far is happening under a darkening cloud over Western societies. Just how much do you believe that resurging anti-Semitism around the world has affected mainstream coverage of the war?
Look, it's part of that, right? I think that the way that we see that coverage today, I was always, for many years, I was the guy who would tell people when someone would say, well, this newspaper is anti-Semitic, this journalist is anti-Semitic. I would say, you know what? They need more information. We have to do a better job educating. We have to, reach out more. Like I always felt that a lot of it was us. And what I've learned during this war is that there is sadly a culture and a foundation of anti-Semitism. And again, like I said before, it doesn't mean that person is anti-Semitic, but that exists. And you see anti-Semitism expressing itself or exhibiting itself in many different manners, whether it's somebody who takes a shot at a Montreal synagogue or school, to whether it's, painting a swastika somewhere, and to reporting on a story in a certain way. It's all connected. These are different forms of anti-Semitism to some extent. And I think that when there is a certain political culture and climate that also allows for this more subtle form of anti-Semitism, which is through media, right? To continue to grow. So you can, if you have a certain political climate in a country, then that allows for the CBC bias or the BBC bias to flourish and to thrive, because they have, if we talk about the UK, for example, there's a government there that is extremely critical of Israel. So therefore, the BBC could say, yeah, maybe we should be better and have more representation and do a better job, as opposed to hiring, for example, as they did in a very famous story, the son of a Hamas minister to be the narrator of a long-form documentary that they put together about the war in Gaza and the impact it's had on children. I mean, literally, you're hiring as a narrator the son of a Hamas minister, right? How does that happen if not you tolerate it because this is the political climate? So I think it all is intertwined one with the other.
Now, how much responsibility falls on information consumers who are ignorant of history, perhaps, or who have been inflamed, compromised by the hate that they consume on their silos in social media? We've seen a great division, very partisan divisions, political divisions in countries, and we've seen social divisions in the same sort of way. But a lot of it, I believe, comes back to the responsibility or the lack of responsibility in information consumers in seeking sources that are tested and reliable.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, whenever I talk to people and they say, okay, so what can we do? Right? What's the answer? There's no magic wand here, right? Sadly, I wish there was. We could make a lot of money if we could invent it. But the real answer, I think, is if you want to be a responsible citizen, educate yourself, question. Don't just buy what you're hearing or what you're reading or what you're seeing. Go at least to one other source. Try to see a different opinion. Don't just read one side, also try to read the other side. Constantly challenge yourself. I think that's the civic duty of people who really want to be knowledgeable in today's world. Unfortunately, though, and this is something that you mentioned earlier, which I think you're 100% right, is that with social media, with the way the media has turned, and it's become more about the personalities and less about the news and less about the facts, more about the opinion, it's much harder to get that, right? And, the one thing that I can hope is that maybe we'll have that pushback at some point where people will recognize that that's the reality and they will start to push away from that and say, no, that's not what we want, right? And you start to hear that in some places, right, where people are moving away from that, but still not enough. So I think that is something that is incumbent upon each and every person to do on an individual basis, and to really try to. They're not going to find the ultimate truth. There's no holy grail out there that they'll suddenly discover, but they can get more data points and more information and just be more aware and be people who can question what they're hearing and what they're saying.
Now, I recently read your book, While Israel Slept, which co-authored with Amir Bobat. And with the Gaza agreement languishing in limbo for the time being, and it could for some time, I believe, I'd like to just discuss a couple of the conclusions of your study. One of your basic conclusions, and some of the facts in your book I found were chilling in terms of the lack of preparedness and the lack of vertical decision making from sources to decision makers. But one of your conclusions was that the war in Gaza is unlikely to be Israel's last war, and that the war will continue to be part, or that war itself will continue to be part of Israel's story, whatever happens now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what we discovered, obviously, was a multitude of failures on all possible levels, right? From the prime minister down to the soldier manning the position along the border, right? This was a failure of policy, it was a failure of strategy, it was a failure of intelligence, and it was a failure of the operational readiness of the IDF, right? Which was meant to, if everything else fails, the soldiers at the border are meant to prevent the invasion. And then, of course, the slow response. I mean, just everywhere you look, a colossal failure on every possible level. But I think that what we also see here is the need and the desire for Israelis, to an extent, to reform, to fix, and to study from these mistakes and hopefully prevent them from happening again. And obviously, it's very politically charged, right? Because there's the prime minister's camp who will tell you we should do it this way and it should be, investigated this way, and the anti-prime minister camp that wants to look at it this way. But at its core, and maybe this ties into what we were speaking about before, is that desire for an investigation in either way, and to understand, because at the end of the day, a country like Israel can't take this for granted, can't take our existence for granted. And therefore, it has to learn those lessons and has to apply them. And I think that need for investigation is something that really is the common theme here to some extent, right? Is to be able to study, learn, apply those lessons.
Now, in the past few years, we've seen that there's a tendency in Western reporting to treat Hamas as something of a legitimate political actor rather than a terrorist entity dedicated to the destruction of Israel and the death of all Jews. How confident are you that the current truce, the agreement, will disarm Hamas and allow it, as you stress, is essential to be completely degraded?
Look, you know what I am? I'm an Israeli on a typical day. I'm skeptical and optimistic at the same time. I'm skeptical that Hamas will ever really truly disarm, because it's without their weapons and without having their ability to exert power and deter and scare and fear and control the 47% of Gaza that they do control, they will no longer exist. And that's the raison d'etre. They have to exist. So to give up their weapons, I just don't see that practically happening. But I'm hopeful, because what I see, Peter, happening on the ground in Gaza is something that has never happened before. And that is, on the one hand, Hamas has been degraded to an extent that we did not realize was possible. Yes, they're still in control of certain parts of Gaza. They still have weapons. They've replenished their ranks, all true. But they are significantly degraded. Number two, and this I think is the big story, the world, the Western world and the Arab world have taken a responsibility over Gaza in the biggest way possible ever. The Board of Peace led by Donald Trump, the International Stabilization Force that's supposed to deploy there, the different Arab countries that are really investing billions of dollars and people and resources, this joint command center that has been set up. People, it's not like it was in the past that, okay, we got the ceasefire, we walk away. No, the investment continues and the work continues. That gives me hope, because I see a taking of responsibility as something that is crucial for the future. And by the way, for the security of the state of Israel, but for the prosperity of the people of Gaza. They deserve a right for a good life as well. So it's not one without the other. It has to come together. For Israel, for the people of Palestine, of Gaza, the Palestinians, for them to flourish, Israel has to have security. And for Israel to have security, the Palestinians there have to have a good life too. It can't go, one can't be disconnected from the other. So they do have to go together. So I'm skeptical. I'm not sure it's going to happen. But I'm hopeful, because I see this taking of responsibility as a real moment that we can't just, make light of it. This is a big deal. And I think it can lead to that dramatic change. And you know what? And here's the final wild card that I think we all have learned to appreciate in the last, 9-10 years or so. And it's called Donald Trump. You never know what this person is capable of pulling off. And sometimes it's for the good, sometimes it's for the bad. But in this case, so far, it's been quite good from the Israeli perspective.
Now, at the same time, among other key recommendations in while Israel slept, was your recommendation that Israel end over-reliance on technology and return to on-the-ground intelligence gathering. But with regards to President Trump, you also recommend that Israel end its over-reliance on the United States weaponry and munitions supply and technology. And a third key recommendation, which brings us back, I believe, partially to the challenges in Western journalism, is you recommend that Israel overhaul and upgrade what you call public diplomacy. What does that mean? And is that governmental? Is it journalistic? Is it
well, I mean,
social?
Yeah, look, so on the intelligence gathering, one of the big problems that we had was we were heavily reliant on technology. So we had all the sensors, we could hear everything, we could see everything, but we didn't have actual assets on the ground. And by the way, you don't need me to tell you that. You had thousands of people who invaded Israel that morning. There wasn't one who could call up their handler. There wasn't one informant who could say, hey, we're coming, right? That shows an abandonment of human intelligence assets, which is, by the way, not just isolated for Israel. It's been happening around the Western world. And it's a natural progression when you think you can, when you think you're intercepting every phone call, email, any communication, you think you can know what's happening in their minds. But we learned is that that's not true. The weapons independence is also super important, right? We need, our relationship with the United States is of existential importance, in my opinion, but we do, and we can't just walk away from it. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but we have to create more independence in our defense industrial base. But the public diplomacy is what we've been speaking about. This is connected to legitimacy, right? You could have weapons, you could have soldiers, but if you don't have the international legitimacy to fight, you won't be able to, especially a country like Israel, which is so dependent on the international community, of course, on its key allies, which in this case is the United States. So you need to retain that international legitimacy. And that is retained through the narrative and the stories that you are telling to the world. Are you justified in your actions or are you not? I feel that Israel has neglected that public diplomacy arena for far too long and needs to really revamp the way we do it. And I'm not even getting into what is the soft power, the messaging that we should be telling, where should we be highlighting, what stories should we be focusing on, but more about the apparatus or the entity that we need to have in the country and in government through which this is done. Because right now we don't take it seriously enough. And that has to change, right? You have amazing organizations and activists and advocacy groups around the world, like Honest Reporting and so many others that are a force multiplier, but they need tools and they need assistance also. They can't be standing there alone. And Israel as a government and as a state has to take this more seriously because, again, it's all connected to one another. The public diplomacy arena with the wars, with the battlefield, whether it's Gaza, Lebanon, or somewhere else. And one feeds the other.
So essentially, you're saying that the government of Israel has to rethink its marketing to the world of its right to exist, of its right to defend itself, either defensively or preemptively.
I mean, 100%. But I also, the thing after October 7th, you have a quick story to tell. It's an easier story to tell after such a disaster. But the response comes, like, we'll just take this as just a simple exercise. The response comes, you're bombing now in Gaza out of self-defense. But Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian infrastructure for a very long period of time. Civilians are going to be killed. Now, wouldn't it have made sense, Peter, in that case, that over a period of years leading up to whenever this war would happen, and here it came by surprise, but you would have prepared the infrastructure and you would have been telling stories to the world of what will happen in a future war because of the way Hamas embeds itself in civilian infrastructure. If you had maybe prepared public opinion around the world, they understood why this is happening, then it wouldn't have come as such a shock, a surprise, and claims of genocide. Now, there's no guarantee that I'm right, because as we spoke about for the last 45 minutes or so, the bias in the anti-Semitic culture is still there. It's not going to go away. But here's the story. Here's what bothers me. We're not even trying. Like, get in the cage and take a swing. You got to play the game to know if you're going to lose the game. You can't just say I lose no matter what. No, that's defeatist. I don't accept that. So, we should have been telling these stories ahead of time and tried to prepare public opinion, or had information ready to immediately be, as opposed to always being responsive and defensive. And that's how it looked throughout this war. That has to change.
Yakov, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope our paths cross in the not too distant future.
I look forward. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Peter and Yakov, for a thoughtful and substantive conversation, and to all of you for spending your evening with us. If tonight underscored anything, it's that the question of the newsroom activist is not about silencing journalism, it's about strengthening it. In an era of polarization and rapid information cycles, rigorous reporting, institutional accountability, and intellectual humility matter more than ever. We hope this discussion encourages continued reflection, not only on how conflict is covered, but on how narratives shape public understanding here in Canada and beyond. Thank you again for joining us, and good night.